Has someone ever tried to make you feel guilty for choosing yourself?
At my brother's birthday dinner, my father raised his glass, and with that smug little smile he reserves for moments when he thinks he's being clever, he said, "To my only successful child," and the entire table erupted in laughter as if it were the funniest, most natural thing in the world to humiliate me while celebrating him, and in that instant I felt something inside me split in a way it never had before, because even though I had grown up used to being the forgotten one, the one who never seemed to measure up, hearing my own father erase me out loud, in front of everyone, stung in a way that no amount of polite smiling could cover. I forced myself to laugh along because that's what I've always done. Played the role of the easygoing daughter who doesn't let things bother her, the one who can take a joke, the one who doesn't mind that her achievements are constantly minimized. But inside my chest I could feel the kind of burning that no glass of wine could wash down, the kind that builds slowly and makes your ears ring while you look around the table at faces you've known your entire life and wonder how not one of them thought to pause or say, "That wasn't funny, that was cruel." Instead, my brother sat there grinning like he'd just been knighted, basking in the praise he's been showered with since we were kids, while his friends slapped him on the back and the rest of the family chuckled nervously, pretending it was harmless banter when really it was a dagger meant for me. This wasn't new, and that's probably what hurt the most, because my childhood had been shaped by moments like this. Report cards where my A's were barely acknowledged while his B's were celebrated as signs of brilliance. Family gatherings where my father introduced him as his future doctor, while dismissing me with a half-hearted, "She's still figuring it out," even though I was the one quietly working 2 jobs to put myself through school while my brother coasted on money and connections that my father made sure were always there for him. Over the years I told myself I didn't care, that it was better to be underestimated, that I could build my life on my own terms without needing their approval. But that night, with every laugh that bounced around the table, it felt like all the years of swallowing my pride and biting my tongue had collected into one enormous weight pressing down on me. I tried to remind myself that this was my brother's night, that it wasn't worth causing a scene, that dignity sometimes means staying quiet even when you're bleeding on the inside. But when I looked across the table and saw my partner's eyes locked on mine, I knew he could see right through the smile I had plastered on my face. He reached for my hand under the table, squeezed it hard like he was trying to anchor me in place, and I could feel the tension in his grip, the way his jaw tightened as he listened to the people I call family laugh at my expense. He has always hated the way they treat me, always said he doesn't understand how I put up with it, but I've brushed it off, told him it's not worth the fight, that family is complicated, and you can't just blow everything up every time someone says something cruel. Still, that night there was a look in his eyes I hadn't seen before, a kind of resolve that made me nervous, because I knew he wasn't the type to just sit quietly and watch someone he loves get humiliated. As the dinner carried on, I could barely taste the food on my plate, the laughter and chatter around me blurring into background noise, every nerve in my body still raw from that toast, every muscle tense with the effort of keeping my composure. My brother launched into some story about his latest big deal at work, puffing himself up as if he were the centerpiece of the entire family's pride, and my father nodded along with that gleam of satisfaction he never once turned in my direction. I tried to focus on cutting my food, on keeping my eyes down, on letting the moment pass like I always had, but my partner never let go of my hand, and when I finally glanced up, he was already pulling out his wallet, sliding it onto the table with a calmness that terrified me, because in that instant I realized he wasn't going to let this one slide. And before I could even process what was happening, I knew he was about to do something that would change everything, something that none of us would be able to take back, something that would finally make my father choke on the smugness he had worn like armor for as long as I could remember. People in my family decided a long time ago that I was the soft one who never quite figured life out, and the part that stings is how easy I made it for them by keeping my head down and answering questions with vague lines about freelancing and contracts and clients. Because every time I tried to explain what I was building, I could feel the air tighten with that familiar judgment that turns curiosity into cross-examination, and I learned that if I gave them less, they would wound me less, which is a sad way to live, but for a while, it worked. What I never said out loud, because the moment it left my mouth it would be turned into a pissing contest that my father would moderate like some warped referee, is that I left a safe job and started taking on unglamorous work no one in my family would brag about, the kind of work that required early mornings and late nights and quiet discipline, and that from there I picked up accounts that became relationships, hired people who trusted me with their mortgages, reinvested every spare dollar, and, without making a single dramatic announcement, turned a side hustle into an actual company that pays salaries, covers health insurance, and signs leases in my name, all while I pretended to be the harmless underachiever who brings dessert and leaves early. I did not tell them when I paid off the loans that used to keep me awake. I did not tell them when I bought my first rental and then another one. I did not tell them when I signed a small warehouse because it made more sense to store equipment than to keep renting space month by month, and I did not tell them when my accountant called to say that, for the first time. She wanted me to think about a different tax structure because I had stepped into a new bracket, since I knew exactly how those headlines would be rewritten at home, not as my hard work paying off, but as ammunition in the never-ending debate about which child makes the family look good at reunions. I kept quiet because quiet felt safe and because my father turns success into a scoreboard and then uses that scoreboard to decide who gets to be treated like a person. And because there is nothing lonelier than sitting at your own family's table and realizing that if you shared the good news, it would be met not with pride, but with a fresh round of comparisons that end with me being told to be more like my brother. So I learned to take the check, change the batteries, fix the lamp, and slip out before the speech-making started. Evan watched this pattern for years and hated it with the kind of patient anger that only grows when you love someone and keep seeing the same bruise show up, and he asked me more than once whether I wanted him to step in and say something, to draw a boundary, to name the cruelty for what it is, and every time I said no because I did not want to give them a new story about how the sensitive daughter needed her boyfriend to fight her battles, yet after the last holiday I told him that if it happened again, if my father went past the usual jabs and pressed the humiliation so hard it left a mark, I would stop protecting their narrative and let him tell the truth. So I called my banker and asked for printed summaries that an older man who distrusts screens would have to respect. I asked my accountant to prepare a letter explaining, in simple language, what the company earns and how it's structured. I stacked everything in a plain folder and slipped it into my bag with the same calm I use when I lock the shop at night, and then, because I know how my family communicates, I drafted a short, practical email to the group asking them to update my mailing address for paperwork, which just happened to include the new company letterhead and the property management suite number, and I queued it to send a little later, because sometimes the quiet revenge is simply letting the truth arrive on its own letterhead. On the drive to the dinner, I told Evan I did not want a scene and that I would only give him the nod if my father crossed a line that could not be laughed off later, and he said he heard me, that he would follow my lead, that he would not move unless I said the word. And I believed him because he has never broken a promise to me, even when it would have been easier to do so. When my father made the toast and the table laughed and my brother added his little joke about how not everyone can be a winner, I felt that familiar pressure at the base of my throat that usually means I will swallow the hurt and excuse it in the car on the way home. But this time I looked at Evan and saw not anger but steadiness. The kind of steady that says we know who we are and we do not need their permission, and I realized that protecting their feelings had cost me years of my own. I reached under the table and tapped his wrist twice, which is what we agreed would be the signal if I wanted him to proceed, and as I did that I felt the smallest, sharpest surge of relief because, for once, I was not going to save them from the consequences of their own performance, and somewhere between the second tap and his chair sliding back, the scheduled email left my outbox and began its quiet way to their phones, carrying my name, my company, my address, and the first tiny crack in a story they thought would never change. The strangest thing about that dinner was how quickly the evening slipped back into its usual rhythm after the toast, as though humiliating me in front of everyone was no more disruptive than clinking a glass for attention. Because within minutes the conversation had moved on to my brother's latest story about closing some deal at work, and the table was filled with exaggerated laughter and impressed nods, while I sat there pushing food around my plate. trying to decide whether I should excuse myself early or stay put and pretend I wasn't suffocating in a room full of people who seemed perfectly comfortable with my erasure. Every word that came out of my brother's mouth grated on me because he delivered it with the confidence of someone who has never known what it feels like to be dismissed, someone who has always been the center of attention and validation. And while I wanted to tune him out the way I usually do, his voice seemed to grow louder and louder until it felt like a spotlight was being swung directly at me, highlighting the fact that I was still sitting there like an unwanted extra in a play written to glorify him. My mother leaned in, laughing in that forced, high-pitched way she always does when she's trying to make the moment lighter. My father smirked with that proud gleam that he never once turned in my direction. And I felt the weight of all those years of biting my tongue stacking on top of each other until it was unbearable. I told myself to breathe, to hold it together, to remember that it was my brother's birthday and that I should not ruin it by making everything about me. But the problem was that it already was about me. Or more accurately, about the deliberate cutting down of me, because every laugh that followed that toast was another confirmation that my place in this family was to absorb the jokes so he could shine brighter, and the thought made me want to leave, not just the dinner, but all of it, because what was the point of showing up if every time I did I was reminded that my role was not to belong but to contrast him? Evan, who had been silent while I tried to steady myself, finally shifted in his chair and squeezed my hand again, and when I looked at him I saw not only anger, but a kind of protective resolve that made my pulse race, because it told me he was finished tolerating what I had convinced myself was tolerable. His jaw was tight, his eyes locked not on me but on my father, as though he was studying him, and I knew, without either of us saying a word, that he was weighing whether to act right there, to turn what had begun as a birthday celebration into a reckoning. And that terrified me because I had spent so long trying to avoid open conflict with my family that I wasn't sure I could handle the fallout if he crossed the line. I tried to distract him, nudging him under the table, whispering something about dessert, hoping he would let it go just for tonight, but he didn't even blink, and in that moment I realized the choice was no longer just mine. That the control I had clung to all these years was slipping through my fingers, because Evan was not built to sit quietly while people he barely respected humiliated the woman he loved. The conversation at the table kept rolling along, my brother now bragging about how his company was flying him to a conference because of his potential, and my father chimed in proudly, repeating the word potential like it was gospel, not realizing how absurd it sounded when his daughter had long since moved from potential to results he never bothered to notice. I felt the sting of every condescending word and saw Evan shift again, his hand moving from mine to his jacket pocket, and in that small movement I knew what was coming, because I had seen him slip those documents in before we left the house. And I had begged him not to make a spectacle, but now he was staring down my father with the kind of calm fury that meant the spectacle was inevitable. I opened my mouth to say something, anything to stop him, but he pushed his chair back slowly, deliberately, and the scrape of wood on tile made everyone glance up from their plates, the laughter fading into confusion as he reached into his pocket, pulled out his wallet, and laid it flat on the table like he was setting down evidence in a courtroom. For a second no one spoke, my father blinking at him in irritation, my brother smirking like he thought this was some kind of awkward attempt at a joke, and then Evan began to slide the folded papers from his wallet, spreading them out carefully on the tablecloth, his expression steady, his voice low but sharp enough to cut through the stunned silence as he said the words that made my breath catch in my throat. "Want to try that again?" And in that exact instant, in the stunned stillness that followed, I knew we had crossed into a place where there was no going back, because whatever happened next, nothing about this family dinner or this family would ever be the same again. The silence that fell over the room after Evan placed those papers on the table was so sharp and sudden that it felt as though someone had drawn a line straight down the center of the evening, dividing everything that came before from what was about to happen next. And while my father tried to maintain the same smirk he had worn so proudly only minutes earlier, the tremor in his hand as he set his glass back down betrayed him before he could even open his mouth. My brother leaned forward, squinting at the spread of papers as though he thought Evan was bluffing, maybe some gimmick or prank to embarrass him on his birthday. But the longer he looked, the more his face began to harden, because even before the words were spoken, he recognized what was staring back at him in black and white statements, balances, and numbers so far beyond his imagination that for the first time in his life, he had no quick line, no smug retort, and no way to laugh it off. Evan's voice, calm but cutting, broke the silence in a way that made every head snap toward him, because he didn't raise it, he didn't need to, he simply leaned back in his chair, one hand still resting protectively on mine, and said with deliberate clarity, "You should probably think twice before you call someone a failure when her company has been carrying more revenue for years than your son will likely see in a lifetime." The words were not shouted, they were not laced with theatrics, but that was what made them so devastating, because they were spoken with the calm certainty of someone who knew there was no debate to be had, no interpretation, no spin, just fact. My father's face went pale, his jaw tightening as if he was about to deny it, but when he reached for the papers and saw the familiar insignia of banks and accountants he respected, when his eyes flicked down and landed on totals that could not be mistaken for exaggeration or forgery, he froze in a way I had never seen before. He opened his mouth once, closed it again, and then shifted in his chair as though the weight of what had just been laid bare in front of him was pressing down harder than his pride could hold up. My mother, sitting to his right, gave the nervous laugh she always gives when she senses the ground shifting beneath her, whispering something about this not being the time, but her words died off quickly when Evan pushed one particular letter toward my father. The one from my accountant outlining, in simple and undeniable language, the scale of what I had built. The reaction around the table was almost as satisfying as the look on my father's face, because my brother's friends, who had been laughing the loudest earlier, suddenly looked at each other in discomfort, one of them muttering something about needing air, while my brother himself sat frozen, his mouth slightly open, his confidence slipping away with every second that he could not form a response. It was as if the entire performance that had defined my family's narrative for decades, the golden boy, the forgotten daughter, the proud father presiding over it all, was collapsing in real time, and the debris was scattered right there on the table in front of us. I did not speak, not yet, because there was something more powerful in letting Evan carry the weight of the revelation for me, something that gave me a sense of safety I had never allowed myself to feel at that table before. My silence was not weakness this time. It was control, because I knew that no matter what words my father tried to summon, no matter what excuses or rationalizations he reached for, the facts would sit there, undeniable, etched into every line of those statements, reminding everyone present that the version of me they had been mocking for years was nothing but a shadow they had invented to make themselves feel bigger. Finally, my brother tried to speak, his voice shaky and higher than usual, muttering something about how money isn't everything, but Evan turned to him with a look so steady it silenced him before the sentence could finish, and with just the faintest trace of dry humor said, "That line only works when you're not losing the scoreboard." The table erupted in nervous shifting, a few people coughing or pretending to fiddle with their napkins, and my brother's face flushed a deep red as he looked to my father for backup, but for once, my father had none to give. For years, I had imagined what it might feel like to finally be seen, not as the disappointing daughter who never measured up, but as the woman who had built something of her own, something real and undeniable. And sitting there watching my father struggle to swallow his pride, I realized that the moment was even more powerful than I had pictured, because it wasn't just about him seeing me. It was about everyone else at that table witnessing the collapse of his favorite story, the one where my brother was the crown jewel and I was the invisible afterthought. The silence that followed was heavy, uncomfortable, and electric all at once, because no one knew what to say, no one knew where to look, and for the first time in my life, the room was not laughing at me, it was waiting on me. And I could feel the shift so clearly that I almost pitied them, because they had no idea that the real reckoning was not just in those papers, but in what I was about to decide to do next. For a long beat no one moved, as if the room itself had to relearn how to breathe now that the script had been torn up in the middle of the performance. And in that breathless pause, all the years I had spent explaining away small cruelties as jokes and large dismissals as family quirks lined up in my mind like receipts that finally balanced. So when the phones around the table began to light up with the scheduled message I had written hours earlier, the one that included my new mailing address, the company letterhead, the suite number, and the simple line about routing any future paperwork to my office, I watched the comprehension move across faces in slow motion, first confusion, then calculation, and finally the kind of quiet that follows a truth too heavy to spin. I did not raise my voice, and I did not deliver a speech, because what I needed to say did not require theatrics, only clarity. So I told my father that I had kept my life small in this house because every time I tried to make it visible, he turned it into a contest he needed to win on my brother's behalf. And that I chose silence not because I was ashamed, but because I refused to hand him a scoreboard he could use to measure our worth. Yet here we were in the same game again, only this time the numbers were on the table and they belonged to me, and I was done pretending that not seeing me was an accident when it had always been a choice. My brother tried to recover his footing with a line about how money comes and goes, and how true success is character, which would have sounded wise if it were not being delivered by a man who had spent the previous hour boasting about conferences and bonuses. And before he could finish, I told him, as gently as I could manage, that the pilot order he had been bragging about all night had come through an intermediary that was, by design, a blind procurement channel owned by my company, set up that way precisely to keep family entanglements out of his career, and that since the conflict of interest had now been put on the table by our father's toast, I would be notifying our compliance officer in the morning to reassign the account on process grounds rather than performance, because I would not be the reason anyone could claim he had been handed anything by blood, even as I would not let my work be used to fuel a story that erased me. The words landed exactly where I wanted them to, not as a threat or a tantrum, but as a clean line, and when my father sputtered something about how I could not take away his son's opportunity, I reminded him that I had never taken anything from my brother in my entire life, that I had done the opposite, kept my distance and my name off of things precisely to avoid tainting his wins, and that the only person who had put his opportunity at risk tonight was the man who needed to perform a victory so badly he forgot which child he was willing to step on to get it. My mother reached for my hand with a tremble that broke my heart because I knew she lives at the fault line between peacekeeping and survival, and she asked whether there was a way to fix this without blowing up the room, and I told her there always had been. That it could have been fixed with fairness a long time ago, that it could still be softened now with a real apology delivered publicly and without conditions, one that did not hide behind jokes or qualifications, and that if my father could manage that, I would keep the account where it was on merit and merit alone, and would put the process in writing so that neither of us could tilt it later, but that if he could not, then the reassignment would stand, and we would all live with the consequences of a truth that should never have needed paperwork to be recognized. My brother stared at the table, color rising to his ears, and for once he did not look at our father for backup, which I decided to take as the first real step he had ever taken by himself. And in that space my father did the one thing he has avoided his entire life, which was sit still and meet what he had built head-on, because even though he could not bring himself to say the words right then, even though pride fought him like a habit he could not break, he looked at Evan, then at me, and I saw in his eyes the knowledge that the era of laughing at my expense was over, not because he had learned, but because I had. I picked up the folder, slid the papers back into Evan's wallet, and reached for the check when it came, not to perform generosity, but to close the evening with the same precision I bring to my work. Handing over a card embossed with the company name my father had just discovered, telling the server to add a 20% gratuity and to split nothing, and as the pen scratched across the receipt I mentioned, almost as an afterthought and exactly as I had planned, that the only family score I intended to keep from here on out would be the one tied to a new fund being launched in our grandmother's name, a fund seeded by me to provide small grants to girls from our hometown who were starting businesses their families did not understand yet, and that the announcement would go out tomorrow morning to the local press with a quote I had already given and a space offered to my parents if they wanted to add a line of their own, because legacies are simply stories we pay enough attention to. Write down, and I was done outsourcing the pen. Evan stood when I did, and no one tried to stop us, because the performance had ended and the audience, for once, had nothing to throw at the stage. And on the way out I paused beside my father's chair long enough to say that I would always answer the phone for emergencies, and that I would never again show up to be small, and if he wanted another toast one day I would stand there and listen. But only if he learned to raise his glass without erasing his daughter, because I had finally learned the truth that made all the other truths bearable, which is that you cannot be invisible in a room unless you agree to disappear, and I was done agreeing.